They said the bloodline was gone. Every heir executed, every name erased, every trace burned beneath the banners of a new age. The empire died with its emperor, or so the history books swore. But centuries later, in a quiet genetics lab, a droplet of dried blood told a different story. The DNA didn't belong to any known royal family. It matched someone impossible. A sequence identical to that of an emperor who died 400 years ago. Which raises a question that no empire, no church, and no archive has ever been willing to answer. How can the dead still have descendants? And that's where you come in. You're not here for the myths or the marble statues. You're here for the evidence, the fragments that hum with the pulse of forgotten dynasties. Take a deep breath, and let's begin with what survived when the empire itself did not. The trail begins not in a palace, but in a laboratory basement, where a sealed relic whispered through centuries of silence. Inside its lacquered wood lay a single invisible drop of blood older than memory, yet still alive beneath the microscope's glow. The test results shook everything, an unbroken genetic echo of a monarch long thought erased. The story should have ended with his execution, but history rarely ends cleanly. Beneath the ashes of empire, someone survived. Someone carried the name, the secret, the inheritance of a vanished crown. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history tried to forget. Because once you start tracing a bloodline that shouldn't exist, you may find it still breathing beside you. You start with silence, the kind that follows a fall so total it leaves the air itself hesitant to move. The empire's last night wasn't marked by ceremony or surrender. It ended in smoke and the echo of doors splintering and banners torn from marble halls. Chroniclers called it the purge of inheritance, the calculated erasure of every name, title, and child that could still lay claim to the throne. You can still find traces of that erasure if you know where to look. Not in grand monuments or royal decrees, but in the absences, the blank spaces in family ledgers, the lines in birth registries scratched out with ink so dark it ate through parchment. One historian once joked that the bureaucracy of destruction outlived the empire itself. There were official forms for confiscating crowns, for burning portraits, even for renaming the living. Every heir was declared extinguished, every bloodline resolved. History closed the book, but history is never that tidy, is it? A single account from a minor archivist buried under decades of dust complicates everything. He recorded that on the morning after the emperor's execution, 3 sealed carriages departed the palace unlisted, uncounted, unclaimed. The guards who escorted them were all reassigned within a week, and when their descendants were later questioned about that day, they all repeated the same phrase we were told not to remember. This is where the investigation begins, not with the glory of a dynasty, but with its disappearance. The official chronicle of the empire's fall reads like a script written for closure. It tells of justice, of divine retribution, of a ruler whose corruption had to be excised for a new world to begin. Conveniently, every eyewitness who might have offered another version of the story vanished before their testimony could be recorded. A few escaped writers claimed the executions were public, but none could describe the emperor's body. No grave was ever shown. No ashes confirmed. The one detail every account agrees on is the fire. The palace burned for 3 days, and when the embers cooled, the old banners were gone, replaced by the crest of the new regime, a stylized phoenix devouring its own tail. The symbolism was deliberate. The empire had died reborn as something clean, untainted. But beneath that rebirth lay the unease of something unresolved, the suspicion that one ember, one life might have escaped the flame. Centuries later, historians still debate whether that suspicion was state propaganda, religious myth, or whispered hope among surviving loyalists. A few fringe researchers point to discrepancies in execution lists, names, duplicated ages, altered entire family branches, corrected in handwriting that doesn't match the original records. Some suggest clerical error, others see deliberate obfuscation. The empire's last census, taken weeks before the fall, lists one infant prince whose record abruptly ends mid-sentence. The ink fades halfway through his name, as if the scribe's hand was pulled away. You remember the DNA result from the relic, that impossible match between the dead emperor and a living man. It's here in the vacuum of the dynasty's erasure that the discovery begins to hum with meaning. If the line truly ended, how could it reappear 4 centuries later in a stranger's genome, unless, of course, someone escaped? Unless the purge of inheritance wasn't as perfect as its architects believed. Even the empire's enemies struggled to fully erase its legacy. Coins bearing the emperor's likeness continued to circulate in remote provinces for years. Local prayers still invoked his name long after it became treasonous to speak it aloud. There's a monastery perched above the ruins of the capital, where frescoes still depict his family, faces partially scraped away, but not completely. When the light hits them at the right angle, the shadows fill in what's missing. You almost see the eyes. The official narrative insists that the dynasty died in purity's fire. But every empire that collapses leaves bones in the archive fragments too stubborn to burn. And sometimes those fragments find their way back into the light. One scholar once remarked, half in jest, that the only way to truly destroy a royal line is to destroy memory itself. Yet memory, like blood, has a way of surviving the executioner's hand. So when you hold that sealed relic in your mind, the one tested in the lab, the one that whispered of impossible inheritance, you begin to realize that its story doesn't start in a museum. It starts here in the night when the dynasty supposedly ended. In the fire that promised to cleanse history, in the silence that followed, where something unseen kept breathing. Somewhere within that silence lies the first trace of survival, faint, contested, but undeniably alive. You've heard the phrase before, that history is written by the victors. But what's rarely said aloud is that the defeated don't always stay silent. Sometimes they speak in margins, in half-finished letters, in symbols that mean one thing to the censor and another to the loyalist. That's how the rumor of the surviving child began, not as a proclamation, but as a whisper stitched between the lines of prayer books and estate inventories. The earliest reference appears not in a royal chronicle, but in a merchant's diary from the western port of Albrecht, dated 3 months after the purge. He describes a night storm, a ship departing under false papers, and a child wrapped in crimson silk, a bundle guarded by 3 men with empty eyes. The entry was dismissed as superstition for centuries. But when you trace the handwriting, the ink, even the watermark of the page, you discover something quietly stunning. The diary was authenticated, its details consistent with imperial courier logs from that same week. Officially, there were no royal ships in Albrecht. Unofficially, 3 left before dawn. That contradiction is the first tremor in the silence. Historians who've studied the empire's collapse often describe the period as a vacuum of evidence. Yet a vacuum doesn't mean absence. It means pressure. The more you suppress a truth, the more it compresses, condenses, and pushes back through tiny cracks in the archive. The whisper of a surviving heir is one of those cracks. Later accounts expand the rumor into legend. A monk's letter from the northern provinces describes a child whose cry halted the wind. Another mentions a sigil carved into the stone of a chapel, a coiled serpent devouring a rose identical to the imperial seal. The same emblem appears again centuries later on a signet ring unearthed during restoration of a cathedral crypt. The ring's gold was traced to mines owned exclusively by the emperor's private treasury. Coincidence, possibly. But coincidence has a strange sense of timing in this story. There's a detail that keeps resurfacing: that crimson silk. In court symbolism, that shade was reserved for royal infancy, dyed using a mixture of saffron and imported cochineal. The recipe was state secret, and the textile's chemical signature hasn't been replicated in modern times. Yet a fragment of identical fabric was discovered in a private collection in Lyon 2 decades ago, woven into the lining of a 17th-century prayer book. The DNA swab from that silk, conducted quietly by a university lab, revealed traces of the same chromosomal sequence found in the lacquered relic from Section 1. 2 centuries apart. 2 separate artifacts. The same impossible bloodline. You start to wonder whether the whisper was ever just rumor. The church's archives include a curious omission: a missing baptismal register from the exact year following the emperor's death. The gap sits neatly between one line of records and the next, as if someone had simply lifted out a page and vanished into the candle smoke. Scholars argue endlessly over what that missing page might have contained: a name too dangerous to preserve, or perhaps a godparent's signature that tied the clergy to treason. Skeptics, of course, dismiss the idea of a surviving child as romantic fabrication, the human instinct to soften tragedy with the illusion of continuity. They point out that no physical remains have been identified, no confirmed descendants recognized. Yet even among them, there's unease. Because documents can lie, but genetics rarely does. When you compare the DNA results from the relic and the silk, the probability of a shared paternal ancestor exceeds 98%. And since the only recorded bearer of that genetic signature was an emperor who supposedly left no living heirs, the numbers force a strange conclusion. Either history miscounted the dead, or science has resurrected a ghost. The whisper takes on a strange vitality when you say it aloud. It's almost melodic, as if the story wants to survive. You can hear it in the cadence of lullabies from remote provinces, songs that reference the hidden flower, the red dawn, or the child beneath the gate. Folklorists long believed these verses were metaphors for rebirth. But one researcher cross-referencing regional dialects noticed that the lyrics form a migration path, each variation drifting westward following the same route the merchant's diary described centuries earlier. Even the empire's enemies seem to sense it. A satirical pamphlet from the new regime jokes, "The emperor's spawn suckles the sea." The line, meant to mock loyalist paranoia, inadvertently records belief in a hidden heir. It's funny how propaganda preserves the very things it tries to destroy. And then there's the seal, that strange repeating emblem found in archives, frescoes, and even modern architecture. A serpent devouring a rose. At first it was dismissed as coincidence, the kind of symbol that reappears across cultures. But one fragment unearthed from the ruins of the old capital bears not only the emblem, but also a cipher: 4 letters, inscribed in microscopic script, identical to initials carved inside the ring found in Lyon. The same pattern spanning centuries. By now the line between fact and fable feels paper thin. Yet within that thinness lies the heart of the investigation. If the dynasty truly perished, why does its language, its symbols, its blood keep resurfacing? Perhaps the empire's greatest illusion wasn't its power, but its disappearance. And as you trace the whisper through archives and alleys, you feel the faintest echo of breath. The sensation that the child who shouldn't exist, the one history buried under ash, is still somehow telling their story. Not in words, but in the persistence of a pattern. You follow the map of exile like a fracture across the continent, a splintered trail of courtiers, generals, and servants fleeing the dying empire. The collapse wasn't a single moment. It was an unraveling drawn out through months of siege and betrayal. For every noble executed in the capital, 3 more vanished into the borderlands with forged papers, stolen jewels, and a quiet promise we will return. It's in those promises whispered to children under foreign stars that the bloodline begins to mutate from royal heritage into survival instinct. History records the exodus in fragments. In one province, an abandoned carriage with imperial crests hidden beneath its paint. In another, a village that burned its church records the night the emperor fell. The new rulers called them fugitives. Loyalists called them pilgrims. Either way, they carried more than just relics. They carried stories, names altered by translation symbols concealed in embroidery, family crests, reimagined as floral motifs. When you trace these transformations, you begin to see the ghost of a dynasty moving behind ordinary faces. One historian found evidence of this in a series of estate inventories from the early 1600s. Among items listed 6 silver spoons of foreign make a child's toy of ivory, and 1 sealed coffer not to be opened. The coffer's seal was a serpent surrounding a rose, the same symbol that appeared in the merchant's diary from Albrecht. The entry was signed by a woman known to have served as a nurse to the imperial household before the fall. Her death certificate lists her as a widow with no surviving kin, yet her descendants still bear a surname that, when translated from its dialectal form, means those who escaped the fire. Coincidence again, perhaps, but in this investigation, coincidence is just history's way of winking. The exiled families didn't vanish. They adapted. Some entered the service of neighboring kings, marrying into minor nobility. Others disappeared into monasteries where vows of silence made perfect camouflage. In the records of one Benedictine abbey, you find an entry for a novice admitted under a false name. The handwriting trembles as if the scribe knew he was writing a secret he shouldn't. The novice's listed birth date aligns exactly with the age the missing infant prince would have been at that time. The same record mentions a relic donated anonymously, a strip of crimson silk bearing the mark of a serpent. The abbey burned a century later, but a piece of that fabric survived in a reliquary hidden inside the church walls. When analyzed in 1997, its dye matched the royal formula lost with the empire. As you study the migration routes, a pattern emerges. They move westward, always west, following trade lines, rivers, and the slow pulse of safety. Some settle in merchant ports, others in quiet valleys beyond the empire's reach. Within 2 generations, they speak new languages and worship under new saints. But every few decades, someone in these families records an omen, a dream of fire, a birthmark shaped like a crown, a child who speaks a forgotten tongue in their sleep. Local folklore begins calling them the Red Line, a term both reverent and fearful. You can almost imagine those nights, a mother whispering lullabies in a language she pretends not to remember, a father tucking a medallion under the floorboards before soldiers arrive. To survive exile, you must learn invisibility. To preserve blood, you must hide it. Generations later, these precautions become habits, and habits become myth. The descendants no longer know what they're protecting. They just feel it pulsing beneath their skin like the ghost of an empire refusing to die. There's one document that ties the Exodus together, the Atlas of the Departed, a 17th century map annotated with coded symbols. Each mark corresponds to a supposed safe house for the imperial diaspora. Most scholars dismissed it as forgery until a handful of locations were excavated in the 1990s. Beneath one ruined chapel in northern Spain, archaeologists found a carved stone depicting the imperial emblem half erased, as if struck by a chisel in haste. DNA recovered from human remains nearby revealed partial matches to the same haplogroup as the lacquered relic and the crimson silk. 3 finds, 3 countries, 1 line of inheritance, faint but consistent. You think back to the whispers from the merchant's diary to the crimson silk and the serpent seal. Each clue seemed isolated, yet here they converge into motion, a diaspora that never called itself one, an unacknowledged migration of royal blood, carried through centuries of secrecy. Even the church archives, usually meticulous, contain letters acknowledging the burden of protected souls, a euphemism used for political refugees of sacred lineage. Protected, not destroyed. Hidden, not forgotten. Still, one question lingers like a breath on glass if the survivors carried their blood into exile. Did they intend to return, or did they know that return was impossible? Some historians argue that the heirs, if any survived, were kept alive not for restoration, but for leverage, living relics. Proof of divine continuity the Church could wield if the new regime ever faltered. Others suggest something quieter, that the survivors themselves chose anonymity, preferring the safety of obscurity to the spectacle of a crown. Either way, the bloodline did not stop at the border. It simply changed form. It blended into other families, other nations, until the empire itself became less a place and more a genetic rumor. Every strand of that rumor winds back to a single night, the night when the empire fell and its children fled west under stormlight. And somewhere among those exiles, one carried not just royal blood, but the spark that would ignite centuries of speculation, the survivor's legacy hidden in plain sight. You've seen obsession before the quiet kind that drives people to spend years tracing the curls of handwriting through dusty registers, convinced that ink and parchment can resurrect the dead. Genealogists, after all, are the modern mystics of lineage. But what happens when their research uncovers something history insists cannot exist? It begins with a woman named Dr. Ilara Voss, a genetic historian with a reputation for dismantling royal myths. Her specialty was exposing false claims to thrones, the self-proclaimed princes, the forgotten heirs, who surfaced every generation to sell their stories to tabloids. Her work was meticulous, skeptical, grounded in cold data. Then, in 2015, she found the anomaly. The discovery came from an independent DNA database, one of those genealogy platforms that promises to find your noble ancestors for a small fee and a cotton swab. A participant from southern France submitted a sample out of curiosity, expecting nothing more than a vague map of migrations. What he received instead was a private email from the research division you've matched with an unidentified historical sequence. At first, Dr. Voss thought it was a glitch. The historical sequence was a control sample taken years earlier from the lacquered relic, the one containing that droplet of imperial blood. The match was statistically impossible. The database wasn't even supposed to contain those results. Someone somewhere had uploaded it unofficially, and yet the numbers aligned with surgical precision. She cross-referenced the man's lineage, farmers, stonemasons, a string of ordinary lives stretching back through the wars of Europe. Nothing noble. No trace of migration from the fallen empire's capital. But genetic code has no respect for paperwork. It speaks in the language of continuity. One Y chromosome marker in particular was identical to the emperor's recorded genetic profile, confirmed by multiple independent laboratories. The odds of such a match occurring randomly, less than 1 in 100 million. For months, Dr. Voss tried to disprove her own findings. She retested samples, reviewed contamination logs, even accused her own assistants of tampering. Nothing broke the pattern. The bloodline, long thought extinguished, seemed to have survived not in marble halls or palaces, but in the veins of a man who repaired roofs for a living. This is the paradox at the heart of her study. If the dynasty truly ended, the match should be impossible. If the match is real, history must have lied. Either way, something is broken, the narrative, the archive, or both. When Dr. Voss published her preliminary report, the backlash was instant. National historians accused her of sensationalism. Geneticists accused her of bias. But what made the controversy truly combustible was the timing. That same year, another lab across the continent published unrelated results from ancient bone fragments discovered beneath a ruined monastery. The mitochondrial DNA inherited through the maternal line bore partial compatibility with the same genetic cluster. It was as if two halves of a shattered lineage were slowly finding each other again through the machinery of modern science. You think back to the exiles, the westward drift of families who hid their names and symbols. Could one of them have intermarried, passing fragments of royal DNA quietly through centuries of anonymity? Or is the pattern a coincidence, an echo distorted by statistical noise? The skeptics point to contamination. The relic, they argue, could have absorbed traces of later handlers. But Dr. Voss had anticipated that objection. She compared the sample's degradation patterns and confirmed that its DNA strands were pre-modern degraded at rates consistent with materials 400 years old. That made contamination impossible without deliberate falsification. And if falsification was the goal, who would gain from it? No government stands to benefit from reviving a dynasty buried by time. What's more unsettling is the discovery that followed. While combing through parish records for the French sample's ancestry, Dr. Voss found a recurring motif in the margins: small hand-drawn serpents encircling roses, the same emblem from the imperial seals, the same symbol found carved into monastery stones and woven into the crimson silk. It appeared in family crests, wedding rings, and even gravestones. None of the living relatives could explain it. "It's just an old design," one said. "Something my grandmother liked." That symbol becomes a thread winding through the centuries, linking genetic data to folklore. It forces historians to confront an uncomfortable idea: maybe the empire's memory didn't fade naturally. Maybe it was buried on purpose. The paradox deepens when you compare population genetics with migration maps. There's a faint but measurable concentration of the same paternal haplogroup along a corridor stretching from the empire's old capital to the Pyrenees. It's as though the blood itself remembers the route of exile, invisible rivers of inheritance flowing beneath modern nations. In a conference presentation that year, Dr. Voss closed her talk with a line that unsettled everyone in the room. "When a dynasty dies, it doesn't disappear," she said softly. "It decentralizes." The audience laughed nervously, not because they thought it was a joke, but because the alternative was too strange to contemplate. You might be tempted to laugh too, to dismiss it as the romantic nonsense of a weary scholar chasing ghosts. But then you recall that the relic's DNA, the silk's residue, and now this anonymous roofer's genome all share a single consistent sequence, a whisper that crosses centuries refusing to be silenced. And perhaps that's the true paradox. History can erase names, burn palaces, and rewrite chronicles, but it cannot edit the code written into blood. The empire may have fallen, but its data remains patient, precise, and waiting to be recognized. Somewhere in the world, descendants of a dead emperor drink morning coffee without knowing who they are. And somewhere a scientist sits before a screen staring at lines of code that hum like a heartbeat. Maps are supposed to tell you where things are, but sometimes they reveal what's been deliberately hidden. You find this out when you open the oldest surviving topographic record of the fallen empire, an imperial chart carved into bronze, stored for centuries beneath a monastery vault. Its lines shimmer under light etched with near mathematical precision. But what draws your eye isn't what's there, it's what isn't. Entire districts of the capital royal gardens, river gates, and sections of the southern quarter have been scraped clean, their coordinates replaced by shallow grooves. The map looks wounded, as though someone tried to erase geography itself. Later reproductions repeat the same omission, as if generations of cartographers copied the silence faithfully, afraid to restore what was once forbidden. It's Dr. Voss again who first notices the pattern. Each blanked area aligns along a narrow axis, a straight line running from the palace ruins through the city's catacombs and ending at a place now marked only as the Red Gate. It no longer exists on modern maps, but 16th-century travel logs describe it as a fortified tunnel leading to the southern frontier, the same route, according to legend, used by the knight carriages that carried the last imperial blood. You trace the coordinates using satellite overlays. The axis cuts cleanly across modern streets, yet underneath the soil tells another story. Ground-penetrating radar scans taken during a metro excavation revealed a collapsed tunnel system roughly 20 meters deep, sealed, reinforced, and filled with centuries of sediment. The city dismissed it as pre-modern drainage infrastructure. But the curvature and materials don't match anything from that era. The deeper you look, the more deliberate the structure becomes. Vent shafts disguised as wells, drainage channels repurposed as passageways. Even the alignment with constellations. The Red Gate, according to the bronze chart, sat directly beneath the star Regulus, known in ancient astronomy as the heart of the lion. The empire's banner, you remember, bore a lion devouring a sun. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. Archaeologists working quietly on the site recovered small fragments, melted glass, splintered ceramics, and most curiously, a fragment of wax seal bearing a partial insignia, a coiled serpent with one wing. The other half is missing. The chemical composition of the wax is consistent with royal courier seals used only for sovereign transport. The kind used historically to mark diplomatic envoys, or more tellingly, vessels carrying members of the royal family. No official record mentions a sovereign transport during the empire's final days, and yet here is physical proof, a seal that should never have existed outside the palace walls, found in a buried tunnel beneath the Red Gate. The find was quietly archived, misfiled as merchant wax, but one anonymous curator annotated the label with a single word, written faintly in pencil: escape. That word changes everything. It recontextualizes the night carriages, the erased map sections, even the strange corridors found under the city's southern hills. What if the purge of inheritance wasn't total because it couldn't be? What if amid the chaos of revolution, loyalists built a network to smuggle the last blood of the throne beyond the empire's reach? Cross-referencing merchant logs reveals a strange cluster of exports recorded in the months before the fall, caravans listed as carrying textiles and votive icons. But the manifests show unusual weight discrepancies, far heavier than the declared cargo. One even bears a note expedited by decree of the inner court, no inspection. That decree was signed 2 weeks after the emperor's supposed execution. Every empire hides something when it dies. Usually it's treasure archives or relics. But this feels like the hiding of a person. A single name protected at all costs, erased from maps, but preserved through blood. When you overlay the old chart with the genetic migration data from Dr. Voss's research, the impossible happens. The path of those DNA clusters mirrors the same southern trajectory. As if blood memory itself traced the exodus route the maps once refused to show. One might call it coincidence. But the precision is uncanny. City by city, generation by generation. The genetic trail shadows the lost road from the Red Gate to the mountain passes of the Pyrenees. Each stop along that invisible corridor yields artifacts with the same serpent and rose emblem. And yet the most haunting part isn't the evidence itself, it's what's missing. The bronze map's edge bears a faint inscription, almost worn to nothing. Under magnification, the letters resolve into 6 words. Not all exits lead to freedom. A warning, perhaps, or a confession. You stare at that phrase, wondering whether the mapmaker knew what they were recording, a route to survival or to something else entirely. If the imperial bloodline truly fled through these tunnels, then someone had to design the path long before the empire fell. That implies foresight, preparation. Someone somewhere knew the end was coming, and they built a way out. You're led to it by accident, or at least that's what the archivist claims. A narrow corridor beneath the city library, its air thick with the weight of parchment and quiet disobedience. The key turns reluctantly in the rusted lock, and behind the door, rows of sealed chests sit like coffins of forgotten knowledge. The archivist says the room doesn't exist on any inventory, which makes it the perfect place to begin. Inside the first chest is correspondence written in a hand you recognize from portraits, the spidery, deliberate script of Chancellor Iron, the last minister before the fall. His letters are marked restricted circulation and addressed not to the royal court, but to provincial abbots and foreign dignitaries. They speak of relocation orders, coded inventories, and the red-marked families to be reintegrated under new heraldry. That phrase, new heraldry, freezes you. It's the bureaucratic equivalent of rebirth. A way to rename blood. You sift through the documents, the pages shedding dust, like the empire shedding identity. Iron's tone shifts from confident to desperate as the years close in. His final entry, dated 3 weeks before the capital burned, reads, "The blood remains. It must remain. The crown may fall, but its pulse must find a quieter rhythm." That's not loyalty. That's a plan. Tucked beneath that note lies a sealed envelope bearing the sigil of a coiled serpent, the same partial design found in the Red Gate tunnel. Inside, brittle parchment bears a list of names written in 2 columns, one labeled deceased, the other absorbed. The absorbed column corresponds almost perfectly with noble families that later emerged during the Restoration period, the same families whose genealogies are curiously incomplete. When you follow one name, House Valtieri, into the official registry, it appears out of nowhere in 1491, granted lands confiscated from the old imperial estates. No origin, no ancestral records, just a royal decree legitimizing a bloodline that seems to have materialized from mist. Historians chalk it up to clerical oversight, but Iron's letters suggest otherwise. The Valtieris, it seems, were never new. They were reborn. The deeper you read, the clearer the pattern becomes. Certain families rise precisely where others vanished. Their coats of arms echo forbidden motifs, the lion and sun reimagined as a griffin, and halo, the serpent and rose, inverted and disguised as a vine. It's camouflage, written in heraldry, a secret code hiding royal descent in plain sight. But not everyone approved. Among the correspondence lies an unsigned sermon draft titled, "The Sin of the Hidden Blood." The author warns of a curse upon those who rename what heaven had already anointed. It implies that some within the church knew about the masquerade and disapproved, which ironically may explain why later archives were censored so meticulously. When power and piety collide, history tends to bleed quietly into silence. The archivist tells you that parts of the room were cleared decades ago by government request. Yet the missing gaps form their own confession. Labels remain without content, Eastern Branch correspondence, custodial records, right of transfer. Each gap another redaction, each absence its own whisper. You begin to see the archive less as storage and more as battlefield, the front line where memory was curated, edited, and sanitized. What's unsettling is the tone of collusion. Iron's later letters refer to the council's assent, suggesting the erasure wasn't rebellion, but policy. If true, the state didn't destroy the bloodline, it naturalized it, reshaping heirs into loyal subjects. The empire didn't die. It privatized itself. One fragment written in cipher bears a date almost too modern, 1728. 3 centuries after the fall. Decoded it reads, "The line remains within House Solenne. Their papers are to be sealed under the name of St. Olivar's Holdings." You check the National Archive Index. St. Olivar's is a small coastal monastery, which incidentally burned in 1730 under unexplained circumstances. Convenient timing if survival depends on smoke. The archivist mentions a rumor among staff that deep in the restricted wing there's a room sealed not by locks, but by family oath. Only descendants of the custodial bloodlines are permitted entry. You laugh softly, assuming it's a myth. But he doesn't laugh back. He simply says, "Some blood opens doors, some closes them." You leave the forbidden archive with the faint scent of wax and mildew still clinging to your sleeves, your thoughts louder than the creaking floorboards. Every record you touched, every letter you unfolded, seems to hum with intent, a careful orchestration of disappearance. Someone somewhere decided that the bloodline must survive but never rule again. And as you step into the daylight, it hits you. This wasn't an accident of history. It was an edit, a redraft of lineage performed not by swords, but by ink. The map from the Red Gate, the genetic drift, noted by Dr. Voss, the whispers of the absorbed families, all of it converges here, in this chamber of silence. What was hidden in tunnels now hides in names, in coats of arms, in the bureaucratic poetry of inheritance. You start to wonder whether any family tree can be trusted at all. Maybe what we call ancestry is just politics in disguise, rewritten every generation to suit whoever holds the pen. And perhaps if you trace it far enough, you don't find a root, you find a crown. The Church has always claimed neutrality, the keeper of souls, not crowns. But every historian knows that when empires die, the clergy inherit their ghosts. You begin to notice this in the ledgers, the way certain monasteries suddenly grew rich during the empire's collapse. Land, gold, custodial endowments, all arriving within a decade of the royal family's supposed extinction. When you follow the paper trail, one name appears again and again, Abbey of St. Yoster. It sits high on a fog-cloaked ridge overlooking the sea, a place more myth than geography. Most of its records burned in a lightning fire in 1684 or so, the diocesan report claims. Yet the surviving fragments, preserved in microfilm copies, tell a stranger tale. A child of royal birth arrived there in winter, carried by night, and accompanied by 2 monks bearing sealed orders from the capital. No name is recorded, just a line written in Latin, "Sanguis servandus est," the blood must be kept. That phrase echoes through every ecclesiastical file you examine. The abbey's expenditure rises inexplicably for the next 20 years. Food tutors, private guards, all under the heading Custodia Vitae. At the same time, court documents from the Restoration mention the Church holding guardianship of a minor orphan of uncertain nobility. The descriptions overlap. Too much coincidence, too carefully worded. Then comes the twist, the abbey's crest, long thought to depict the rising sun of resurrection, is in fact a lion's mane encircling a chalice, the same symbol found faintly carved into the reliquary that held the emperor's supposed blood sample. You feel the circle closing. The Church didn't just preserve relics of the empire's faith, it preserved its flesh. Dr. Voss once joked that religion and genetics have more in common than either side wants to admit, both obsessed with inheritance, both claiming to guard the truth of origins. She wasn't wrong. The deeper you dive into these archives, the more the church begins to look less like a bystander and more like a custodian of dynastic continuity. A sanctified cover-up. One letter unsigned but dated to 1559 speaks of keeping the seed from unworthy soil. It refers to the heir's education, health, and future sanctification. A later marginal note reads, "The boy has taken well to the name given him. His bearing betrays his heritage." The phrase bearing betrays repeats in multiple places, as if even centuries later, the church feared the mirror might reveal too much. And yet history records no such boy. No orphan, no noble protégé, no mysterious novice raised within the abbey walls. What the chronicles do mention is the sudden appearance of a young priest named Lucien d'Avare, brilliant, eloquent, appointed to the Vatican's diplomatic wing at an unusually early age. His family background, of uncertain but respectable origin. It's the same phrasing used in the 1559 document. You can almost see the ink connecting across centuries. The church's fingerprints also appear in more material ways. Several reliquaries held by Saint Eostre and later transferred to Rome contain fragments of bone and hair, tagged with royal provenance, relic of Saint Aurelis, martyr of the crown. But isotope testing done discreetly in the early 2000s revealed something uncomfortable. The DNA matches the same genetic profile that Dr. Voss identified in the sealed relic, meaning at least some of these saints may have been imperial blood repackaged as divine artifacts. One might call that desecration or devotion. It depends who wrote the story. You find correspondence between abbots discussing the moral burden of containment. One writes, "It is a sin to hide the truth, yet a greater sin to expose it." That line reads like confession disguised as policy. The church didn't destroy the bloodline because destruction would have been blasphemy. Instead, it spiritualized, it turned royal heirs into relics, heirs into monks' thrones, into altars. You think back to the map from Section 6, the Red Gate's sealed tunnels. One tunnel reportedly ended beneath the old cathedral crypt, which was conveniently expanded during the early restoration under liturgical renovation. What if the tunnels weren't just escape routes, but handoffs, passages designed to deliver the bloodline into holy custody, where no secular power could touch it? A few surviving sketches hint at exactly that. Annotations on a 17th-century church blueprint mark a chamber beneath the altar of silence. Its purpose, custodia sanguinis, the guardianship of blood. No record of the chamber remains, but when engineers restored the cathedral foundation in 1981, they found a sealed cavity containing 2 wooden caskets, both empty, both lined with gold thread. The contents had already been removed. The church called them symbolic tombs. You're not convinced. Even the Vatican Library's restricted codices show traces of the same story annotations referring obliquely to the custodians of the vein, a brotherhood, tasked with preserving what was royal so that the world may never thirst for kings again. You can't decide if that's faith or irony. And then there's the Vatican's modern stance, silence. When journalists ask about the imperial relics or the lost abbey records, the official response is curt, no comment. Yet a private email from a retired archivist tells you more than any statement could. "We kept them safe," he writes, "but not for their sake, for ours." It makes sense. A bloodline with divine endorsement would threaten every theology built on the idea of chosen order. Better to keep that blood quietly sanctified, its descendants cloistered in anonymity. Not rulers, not rebels, just custodians of a story that could never be told. And so the church became both vault and veil protector of the secret and prisoner to it. Even now, as you stare at the faint signatures, the wax seals, the Latin mottos, you can almost hear the echo of that first decree, sanguis servandus est. The blood must be kept. and perhaps it still is. The parchment is brittle, its ink browned to the color of dried leaves. At first glance, it looks like a treaty, a formal alliance between noble houses sealed under the auspices of an unnamed council. But when you unfold the document completely, you realize this isn't diplomacy. It's devotion. A blood oath. The date is clear, 1712. The signatures are not. Each is written in cipher, the same serpentine script found in Chancellor Iron's letters, and again on the seal recovered beneath the red gate. The wax impressions show identical marks, a serpent coiled around a chalice. Beneath each, a phrase in Latin, vivit per lineam. It lives through the line. You study the text under magnification. It reads like a legal document, written by someone terrified of being understood. The signatories pledge loyalty to the rightful sovereign, whose name is hidden for the safety of the realm. They vow to preserve the linea sanguinis, the bloodline, through custodial inheritance, ensuring its continuity even if the throne remains empty. Historians long dismissed the oath as apocryphal, a 19th-century forgery crafted by political romantics. But then came the discovery of a twin manuscript, the same text, the same signatures, in the private archives of House Valtieri, authenticated by carbon dating to the early 18th century. House Valtieri again. The absorbed family from the Forbidden Archive. Their motto, Sub Rosa Fidelis, faithful under the rose. The link is impossible to ignore. The oath appears to mark a transition from hiding to inheritance. The scattered descendants of the fallen empire no longer just survived. They organized. Not as pretenders seeking crowns, but as keepers of legitimacy. The language is clear: we renounce dominion, yet preserve descent. The empire's bloodline, now stripped of empire, redefined itself as the invisible thread binding Europe's aristocracy. You begin to trace the signatories. One cipher, when decoded through the heraldic index, points to a northern duchy, whose family later married into the House of Solesmes, the same name referenced in the encrypted 768 letter found in the Forbidden Archive. Another corresponds to a lineage absorbed into a British peerage in 1740, whose descendants still bear a serpent motif in their family crest, disguised as ivy. It's as if the oath formalized what the Church had quietly curated for centuries, a network of bloodlines all sworn to keep their shared origins silent. Dr. Voss once mentioned that several noble families in Europe display a peculiar mitochondrial anomaly, a marker that doesn't appear anywhere else in recorded genealogy. At the time, it seemed trivial. Now that anomaly becomes a signature. The oath wasn't merely symbolic. It was biological insurance. The families intermarried strategically to preserve a genetic fingerprint across centuries, ensuring that the linea sanguinis, the emperor's blood, would never be diluted beyond recognition. You can almost imagine the candlelight in that 1712 chamber, the smell of iron and ink as each noble pricked a finger, mingling blood into the same bowl before signing the document. It wasn't superstition, it was preservation through ritual, a genetic compact disguised as piety. But the oath didn't remain hidden forever. In 1894, a French historian named Roux claimed to have seen a reference to it in a papal archive describing it as the Pact of the Veiled Princes. 2 years later, Roux drowned in the Seine under uncertain circumstances. His notes vanished, but a single fragment survived, a marginal annotation on one of his students' manuscripts. They still write to each other in the old cipher. The handwriting is Roux's. That phrase opens an entirely new possibility, that the blood oath of 1712 wasn't a one-time event, but the beginning of a hereditary network that continued to renew itself generation after generation. You find evidence of later oath renewals in coded correspondence from 1783, 1816, 1919, always marked with the same Latin refrain, per lineam et silentium, through lineage and silence. And perhaps most astonishingly, the genetic research from Section 5 aligns perfectly with the descendants of several families tied to those renewal dates. It's as though every century the invisible order ensured the blood remained traceable, though only to those who knew where to look. What unsettles you most, though, is the political reach. Cross-referencing the names with parliamentary archives and banking directories reveals a chilling consistency. Many of these families held disproportionate influence in finance diplomacy and education reform, not as kings or conquerors, but as quiet custodians of continuity. They didn't rebuild an empire. They became the invisible architecture behind the new world that replaced it. The oath ends with a line written in deliberately archaic Latin, cum sanguis mane regnum dormit. While the blood remains, the kingdom sleeps. It's not a declaration of defeat. It's a promise. You find yourself staring at the document longer than you should. The parchment hums faintly under the lamp's glow as though memory itself refuses to fade. You remember the warning carved on the bronze map. Not all exits lead to freedom. Perhaps this was one of those exits and escape that became a prison of its own making. If the oath still binds its signatories' descendants, then the empire didn't die. It simply changed shape, withdrawing from marble and throne into veins and vows, waiting patiently beneath history's skin. And for the first time, you start to wonder whether the real secret isn't about survival at all, but about restraint. A lineage powerful enough to reclaim the world and disciplined enough never to try. The coordinates lead you to a stretch of land on the outskirts of Vienna, a cluster of decaying estates swallowed by ivy, their walls blackened by rain and time. Locals call it das namenlose Haus, the nameless house. No records list its owner, no tax rolls, no deeds. Yet someone tends the grounds. You can see the candlelight moving inside. The air is heavy with the smell of old paper and something metallic. You step through a half-open door, its hinges sighing like a warning. Inside, the rooms are lined floor to ceiling with portraits, hundreds of them, all depicting the same face through different centuries. The clothes change, the painting styles evolve, but the eyes remain identical. On the central wall hangs a fresco, unlike the rest, an unfinished depiction of a throne room. The figure seated on the throne wears no crown. His hand, though, rests upon a globe, a symbol used only in the empire's final years. Beneath it, carved faintly into the plaster, is a date 1712, the same year as the blood oath. At the base of the fresco is a bronze plaque, its inscription half-worn but legible, Custos Umbrae, Keeper of the Shadow. The phrase appears once in the oath, designating a single individual entrusted to oversee the continuity of the line. You move deeper into the house, and the air grows colder. The library doors are chained, but behind them you can see faint movement, a draft or something else. In a side chamber, you find a table covered with recent documents, property maintenance invoices, a shipment of archival materials, a power generator installed just months ago. All signed under the same pseudonym, C. Umbra. Whoever the keeper is, they're not gone. On the desk lies a ledger filled with meticulously written entries spanning centuries, births, deaths, unions, all connected by sigils matching those from the blood oath. The handwriting changes, but the initials remain constant, CU, over and over across generations. You turn the final page. The last entry is dated only 2 years ago. Subject relocated. The blood secure. The silence continues. Beneath it, a single drop of dark brown ink or blood stains the margin. Suddenly you realize something. This isn't just a record. It's a relay. The keeper's duty isn't immortal, it's inherited. passed down through chosen custodians, each adopting the title Custos Umbrae as both burden and disguise. Their identities erased their purpose unbroken. A folded letter slips from the back of the ledger. You open it carefully. It's addressed not to a person, but to a place, Archivum Veritatis 17 Rue Saint-Michel, Genève. The same street where, according to Dr. Voss's notes, a private foundation was established in 1949 to preserve European genealogical records. The letter reads simply, "The circle endures." The next cycle approaches. The blood remains faithful. No signature. Only the seal of the coiled serpent and chalice embossed, not inked. You step back, heart hammering, when a faint sound echoes from the floorboards above, a creak deliberate and paced. Someone's still here. You freeze, listening as the sound drifts closer to the staircase. Then silence. The portraits seem to lean forward in the dim light, their painted gazes converging upon you. Every face, the same eyes, the same blood, watching the intruder who's finally found their hidden house. And then, from the hall behind you, a whisper in perfect Latin, "Dormit rex, sed non mortus est." The king sleeps, but he is not dead. You spin around, but the corridor is empty. Only the faint scent of extinguished candle wax lingers in the air. You leave the house before dawn, your camera filled with proof no one will believe, and one lingering question that won't let you go if the line never broke. Then who exactly are they waiting for to wake? You arrive in Geneva 2 weeks later, drawn by the address from the nameless house, 17 Rue Saint-Michel. From the outside, it's nothing remarkable, a mid-century office front, with opaque glass windows and a small brass plate that reads, Archivum Veritatis. But inside, the air feels wrong, not stale, preserved. The lights hum softly over rows of steel cabinets, each tagged with handwritten codes, A23 G7-1 LWEX 45. An elderly archivist greets you without surprise. Another researcher, she says, her accent faintly Eastern. You're here for the continuity files. She leads you past a coded gate into a climate-controlled vault. The deeper you go, the colder the air becomes until your breath fogs against the sterile light. Inside the vault, each cabinet drawer holds bound folios, parchment sheets sealed in glass sleeves. At first they look like family trees, branching genealogies written in Latin, French, and Old German. But then you notice the pattern. Every branch ends abruptly, around the same date, 1799. Then, instead of names, the branches continue with numbers. Why replace names with numbers, you ask? The archivist hesitates, then replies, because names die. Numbers inherit. Each number corresponds to a blood sample vial preserved in nitrogen. Dozens of them lined like a silent census. You realize with a shock that these aren't abstract genealogies. They're genetic maps, the quantified record of a single bloodline preserved and traced across centuries. You find one file marked with a sigil you've seen before, the coiled serpent and chalice. Inside is a document stamped Linea Aurea, restricted. Beneath it, a description, successive carriers of the regal sequence verified through maternal transmission. Status latent preserved. Regal sequence. The term sounds almost mythical, but beside it is a modern reference, mitochondrial haplogroup H1E2B. You cross-check it with Dr. Voss's data. It's identical to the mysterious cluster she identified from the exiled nobility in the Pyrenees. The bloodline didn't vanish. It adapted. You open the next folder, Continuation Protocol. It outlines a 19th century experiment conducted under the patronage of the Custodes Umbrae. The notes describe the deliberate pairing of distant descendants, ensuring the genetic sequence remained intact across generations. The process wasn't mythic preservation, it was calculated curation. Suddenly the fragments align, the erased maps, the sealed tunnels, the keeper's records, all part of a single centuries-long operation to protect the blood that once ruled an empire. Not to preserve a throne, but a claim. The final page bears a typed statement dated 1953 signed by an anonymous CU project Aurora succeeds. Carrier confirmed. Line remains unbroken. Await directive from the House. Below it, a medical photograph sepia-toned shows a newborn with a faint spiral birthmark on the wrist. The back of the photo reads only subject L47. You check the recent records, the last entry is from 2011. The location listed reassigned, Central Europe. Status active. The archivist sees your expression and lowers her voice. You shouldn't look further, she warns. They never stopped keeping watch. When you leave the archive, you glance back through the frosted glass. For a moment, you swear you see a figure at the window, tall, motionless, wearing a dark coat. And on the glass, the faint reflection of a spiral mark glowing in the dim light. The bloodline didn't just survive history, it learned to hide inside it. You wake to the sound of rain against an old hotel window. Geneva has turned gray overnight, a sky the color of tarnished silver. On the table beside you lie copies of the continuity files spread like the wings of some paper creature. Names replaced by numbers, centuries condensed into data, a dynasty rewritten as DNA. You stare at one code in particular, L47, the living thread of a forgotten empire. You trace its migrations on a map, from Constantinople to Venice, Venice to Vienna, Vienna to Bavaria. Then across the Channel to England, where the trail dissolves into modernity. And yet the surname that appears again and again in censored British archives. Loring bears an uncanny resemblance to Lorenz, a name once tied to the emperor's brother-in-law. Linguistic drift or deliberate disguise. At first it seems coincidence, but then the financial records surface. The Loring family, old but discreet, has for 2 centuries held controlling interests in private banks that once managed the empire's war funds. Their estates line the same trade routes the exiled nobles took. Their crest, once a lion rampant, now shows only a single coiled serpent. And on the youngest heir's left wrist, seen in a glossy magazine photo, rests a faint spiral scar. The bloodline isn't extinct, it's incorporated. The realization reshapes everything. What if the fall of the empire wasn't an end, but a metamorphosis from sovereign power to silent influence? You think of the custodes umbrae, the guardians who kept the line safe. Safe from whom or for what? The answer might lie in what they built instead of a throne. Through the 19th century, their descendants became patrons of rail networks, shipping conglomerates, and early insurance firms, the unseen architecture of industrial Europe. When monarchies fell, they lost crowns but gained corporations. Titles died, but dividends endured. One line in a continuity report stands out. The blood no longer rules. It regulates. You dig deeper. Documents from the 1920s show members of the Loring Trust quietly financing restoration projects across Eastern Europe, monasteries, archives, even DNA sample preservation facilities. In one ledger, a familiar symbol appears beside the expense column, the serpent and chalice embossed in gold. The custodes were never a secret cult. They became a board of directors. And yet, the myth persisted. Every few generations, rumors would flare: a child born with the imperial mark, a noble family suddenly withdrawn from public view, a fortune quietly moved offshore. Scholars dismissed it as hereditary superstition, the same way alchemists once disguised chemistry as ritual. But the difference now is measurable. Gene sequencing confirms the continuity of an unbroken line stretching through all those quiet corridors of wealth. You recall what Dr. Voss told you before she vanished. History isn't what we write. It's what we breed. Her notes hinted at something beyond lineage, a potential biological trait, subtle but persistent, increased resilience, faster clotting, and unusual immunity profile. The kind of small, invisible advantage that might have once been considered divine right. It's tempting to romanticize the idea of sacred blood chosen by destiny. But what you see in those files isn't divine. It's designed. A dynasty that refused to die simply adjusted to the new age, turning blue blood into blue chip. Still, one question lingers like a whisper you can't shake. Why preserve the blood at all, if not to reclaim something? Some theories point to a document never published, the Second Edict of Succession, supposedly written in the empire's last days. It proclaimed that sovereignty was not confined to territory, but to lineage, the realm within the veins. If true, then survival itself was victory. You step outside into the rain. Across the street, a cafe television flashes an interview with a smiling philanthropist, Lord Adrian Loring, discussing humanitarian aid in Eastern Europe. His voice calm, his manner unassuming. And there, as he raises his hand, the camera catches it, a faint spiral birthmark, right where the empire's legend said the mark would bloom. History insists the line was extinguished. The archives whisper otherwise. And the storm that brought down an empire you realize never truly passed. It simply learned to reign in silence. You spend the night sifting through a decade's worth of financial records, news clippings, and genetic abstracts. Together they form something like a constellation of scattered points that, when connected, reveal the faint outline of an empire that never really died. You realize that the dynasty didn't lose power. It simply changed its definition. The crown was replaced by capital, the throne by influence and dominion, became a matter not of territory, but of continuity. It begins quietly in the 18th century, when scattered heirs and loyalists took refuge in merchant cities, Venice, Geneva, Bruges. There their descendants married into trading dynasties, banking families, and shipping cartels. The imperial seal was no longer stamped on decrees, but embossed on letterheads. Even the church, so eager to bury the bloodline, seems to have cooperated. Some of its most powerful benefactors carried the same genetic markers, discreetly verified by Vatican medical orders. By the early 20th century, the pattern sharpens. The descendants of the exiled nobles hold board seats across a handful of private institutions that effectively manage European infrastructure, rail, steel, and post-war reconstruction funds. Coincidence? Or a calculated restoration hidden in plain sight? In one photograph from 1946, taken at the signing of a reconstruction treaty, you spot something extraordinary. 4 of the attendees, men in identical dark suits, wear tie pins etched with a symbol that hadn't been seen since the empire's fall, the serpent and chalice. You check the roster. One is a Loring, another a descendant of the Bavarian Lorenzes. The other 2 share the mitochondrial sequence marked Regal H1E2B. It's absurdly audacious. The empire rebuilt itself not as a nation, but as an organism, distributed, resilient, self-sustaining. When monarchies crumbled, it adapted. When revolutions came, it financed both sides. And when republics rose, it whispered policy through philanthropy. Power, you realize, didn't vanish. It mutated. But not all mutations are stable. Hidden among the archives are letters from the 1970s addressed to a private institute in Zurich. They warn of instabilities within the lineage, psychological, sometimes physical, arising after generations of selective breeding. One scientist refers to it chillingly as the cost of purity. The very blood they sought to preserve had begun turning against itself. Still, the empire persisted. Its descendants learned discretion, replacing titles with trusts, coats of arms with logos, and divine right with public relations. The Loring Foundation's modern motto, continuity through progress, is so ordinary it almost escapes notice. Yet within their archives, continuity means something far older. You find one final piece of the puzzle, a redacted transcript from a 1999 symposium on European succession laws. In it, a geneticist presents findings linking dozens of political and financial leaders to the same mitochondrial sequence once identified in the imperial house. He's interrupted mid-lecture. The session notes end abruptly with the words, "Moderator intervention. Publication withdrawn." You think of all the times you've brushed past history's edges, the sealed tombs, the whispered archives, the names erased and rewritten. Every discovery led not outward but inward to the same pulse, the same lineage, the same quiet heartbeat echoing beneath modern civilization. Perhaps this is the ultimate irony: the empire never sought resurrection because it never truly died. It simply changed its skin. Each corporation, each trust, each foundation, all extensions of a single ancient instinct to preserve itself. The blood, as the continuity archives put it, no longer rules. It regulates. You close the final folder, and for the first time you feel the weight of what you've uncovered. It's not just a historical curiosity, it's a mirror. The systems we live under, the institutions we trust, the patterns of inheritance and influence that decide who thrives and who fades, all of them might still beat to that same ancient rhythm. The fallen empire didn't collapse. It went internal. And somewhere beneath the calm surface of modern order, its pulse still ticks, quiet, patient, and utterly undying. You return home with a single folder in your bag, thin, unmarked, but heavier than it should be. The rain that followed you across Europe seems to have settled here too, turning the streets into glimmering mirrors of the city lights. For the first time in months, you're no longer chasing the past. You're holding it. Or maybe it's holding you. Inside the folder, one DNA report, one letter, and a fragment of the Second Edict of Succession, the one whispered about in the Forbidden Archive. The report confirms what you already suspect: the mitochondrial line marked H1E2B still circulates active in a handful of living individuals. The letter, unsigned, bears the same serpent and chalice seal and a sentence written in perfect looping Latin: sanguis regit etiam sine corona, the blood rules even without a crown. You read it twice, then again, because it sounds less like prophecy and more like resignation. For centuries, the empire's story was written as tragedy, fire, betrayal, extinction. Yet every scrap you've found insists otherwise. The supposed execution of the royal children was a performance for the crowd. The clerical records were edited, the tombs intentionally mismarked. What history calls extinction was in truth erasure by design. Not to end the line, but to save it. To let it dissolve into the bloodstream of the world. You think back to the patterns: the merchants who became bankers, the generals who became industrialists, the heirs who became philanthropists. Their names changed, but their behavior didn't: secrecy, continuity, preservation. Even now, in quiet boardrooms and foundation meetings, the same blood might be guiding decisions that ripple through the modern age. And yet, what does it mean to inherit such a burden? You've seen the cost. The mutations, the instability, the need for concealment. Some descendants didn't even know what they carried. Others turned the legacy into ideology or obsession. A few perhaps tried to escape it, changing names, marrying outside the circle, disappearing entirely. But no one really outruns ancestry. History, like blood, always finds a way home. You take the DNA report and set it beside your own test results, the control sample you gave Dr. Voss before she vanished. The numbers line up in strange symmetry. Not identical, but connected. Enough to raise an impossible question: how many threads of this empire still live unwoven quietly into ordinary people? How many of us unknowingly carry the residue of something vast and extinct, a flicker of forgotten sovereignty that no crown could contain? That's the paradox, isn't it? The closer you come to truth, the more it refuses to resolve. Maybe the empire's survival isn't a conspiracy, but a condition, one that repeats itself every time power falls, yet refuses to die. Every dynasty, every revolution, every corporate hierarchy is just another echo of that first instinct to endure. You close the folder, sealing the evidence away. There will be no final revelation tonight, no triumphant confirmation that the emperor's blood still walks among us. Only the quiet, unsettling understanding that history never ends. It simply changes names, waiting for someone else to look close enough to see the pattern. As you switch off the light, you notice something faint on your wrist. Not a mark. Not really, just the outline left by pressure fading as your pulse steadies. You smile. Coincidence, you whisper, though the word feels lighter than truth. Maybe that's how empires survive. Not through monuments or decrees, but through memory, diluted yet persistent, flowing quietly beneath everything we think we've built since. It ends the way all secrets do, not with revelation, but with a kind of peace. The storm of discovery has passed, and what remains is a soft, persistent hum beneath the world. You sit by the window, the same folder resting on your lap, and watch the city dissolve into evening. The lights blur into gold through the glass, each one flickering like a memory refusing to fade. You think of the empire of fire, of silence, of the blood that would not die. The names, the seals, the archives, all the threads you followed into the labyrinth. Somewhere in those centuries of deceit and preservation, the truth became less about lineage and more about what it means to endure. Every ruler falls, every dynasty fractures, yet something, call it will or design or just survival, keeps flowing forward, adapting to each new age. Maybe that's what blood really is. Not destiny, but persistence. The quiet refusal to disappear. You breathe slower now, letting the thought settle. The rain has stopped. Only the low murmur of the city remains. For a moment, you imagine the world as one vast body pulsing with hidden veins of history. Empires within nations, secrets within stories, lives intertwined by echoes of forgotten thrones. And in that rhythm, you feel your own pulse answering. It doesn't matter whether the emperor's descendants still walk among us. The idea of them has already done its work. It has reminded you that power never truly dies. It only changes its form, wearing new faces, speaking in softer tones. The crown becomes a signature. The palace becomes a boardroom. The royal decree becomes policy written by unseen hands. You close your eyes. Somewhere a clock chimes. You imagine the bloodlines whispering through time, their influence dissolving into hours, until the boundary between myth and biology disappears. Maybe that's the truest legacy of all that. In trying so hard to preserve themselves, they ended up preserving us. The folder slides shut with a faint sigh. The serpent and chalice gleam one last time before fading into shadow. You whisper a final thought to the dark, that perhaps the empire never fell at all. Perhaps it only learned to breathe through other hearts. And as the night folds over the city, your pulse slows, the sound of it fading into the quiet rhythm of history, a heartbeat that has never really stopped.